Данный фильм является учебным и разработан для двигателей BMW серии K&L Engines, который объясняет, как правильно разобрать и собрать поршень на данной серии ДВС, а также является наглядным пособием уплотнительного устройства штока поршня.
Here, the piston has been lifted out of the cylinder and is being lowered into working position. A special piston support has been mounted over an opening in the upper engine platform. Thanks to this arrangement, work can be performed on the piston from the upper platform, and the stuffing box can be overhauled while working on the middle platform. The piston is now in position over the support and is being supported by screws. First, the piston rings must be checked to see if they are sticking or broken. Always use the special piston ring expander when removing or mounting rings on the piston in order to prevent deformation of the rings. The piston rings are cleaned and checked. Measure the radial width of the rings. For K90GF engines, rings with a radial width of 23.5 millimeters or less must be replaced. A new ring measures 28 millimeters. The piston top is now cleaned with a scraper and a wire brush. After cleaning, the amount of burn-away is measured over the entire circumference of the piston top using a special template and a rule. Should burn-away exceed 25 millimeters anywhere, or if cracks or other defects are present, the piston top must be replaced. The ring grooves are then cleaned and checked for defects. The wear of the ring groove is to be measured. A new ring is placed in the upper piston ring groove. The vertical clearance between ring and groove is then measured with a feeler gauge. Once the uppermost groove has been checked, work downwards, groove by groove. A new ring in a new or reconditioned groove has a vertical clearance varying between 0.35 to 0.40 millimeters. With a new ring in a worn groove, the maximum clearance permissible is 0.7 millimeters. Should the clearance exceed this limit, the ring grooves must be reconditioned. Replacement of piston crown and cooling insert, K engines, earlier procedure. It is recommended to disassemble the piston approximately every 16,000 running hours, to exchange O-rings, and to check the cooling insert. If the piston top burn-away exceeds the permissible tolerances, or if other defects should be present, the piston crown must be replaced. The piston is still in position on the support. Mount the lifting tool onto the special groove on the top of the piston. Lift the piston and mount a collar around the piston rod. See that the support legs point downwards. Lower the piston so that the collar is positioned correctly on the support. Place wooden blocks under the piston rod end to give added support and prevent it from slipping in the collar. For dismounting of the piston crown, the assembling screws for the piston skirt and crown are to be removed. The piston is now resting firmly in work position, and most of the screws fastening the piston crown and the piston skirt have been loosened so that the crane hook can be attached. The remaining screws are loosened and the piston skirt is lowered onto the collar. Lift off the piston crown. Should it jam, it can be freed by tapping lightly with a mallet. The O-rings are removed from the piston rod and discarded. The cooling insert and the inside of the piston crown are checked for deposits of coke. Scrape and brush clean the joint faces of the cooling insert. For dismounting of cooling insert, the cooling oil pipe is first removed. Then the fastening screws for the cooling insert are removed. Remove all 4 screws and locking discs securing the cooling oil pipe. Attach the lifting tool and lift out the cooling oil pipe. Now, attach the same lifting tool to the cooling insert and remove the socket head cap screws. Lift away the cooling insert. Exchange the old insert for a new or reconditioned one, which is mounted in place. Place the cooling oil pipe back in the piston. The lifting tool is removed and the pipe is mounted with screws and locking discs. Two new O-rings, lubricated with a little oil, are placed in the grooves on the piston rod. A new or reconditioned piston crown is now lowered onto the piston rod. See to it that everything is perfectly clean before raising the piston skirt with the help of the 3 lifting hooks. The 2 guide pins are now positioned for correct mounting of the piston skirt. At this time, only 4 mounting screws are attached in an X form around the crown. This is sufficient so that the crown remains in place while the whole piston is turned upside down. Replacement of piston crown and cooling insert, K&L engines. New procedure. There are certain procedural differences between the disassembling of the piston on earlier engines, such as the K90GF, which we have just shown, and the newer K&L engines. Here, a cross-section of the K67GF piston is shown. The vital difference between this design and earlier designs is the mounting of fastening studs for the cooling insert. Nuts for these studs can be loosened from above without lowering the piston skirt. The screws holding the cooling oil pipe are loosened. The lifting device attached and the pipe lifted out. The cooling insert is loosened and the nuts and locking discs are removed. Now the lifting device is attached to the cooling insert, which is also lifted out. The O-rings on the piston rod are removed and discarded. The joint faces on the piston skirt and cooling insert are cleaned carefully. Begin reassembly by mounting new O-rings on the piston rod. Lift the cooling insert and fit the 4 stud bolts into place. Tighten the 4 nuts diagonally from each other with a skeleton spanner. And secure them with locking discs. The remaining parts of the assembling procedure are in principle similar to those for the K90GF already shown. Pressure testing the piston, K90 engine. Lift the piston with the lifting tool enough to tighten the collar round the piston rod. The support legs on the collar must be pointing upwards. When the piston is resting on the support, fit stays and crossbar onto the tilting tool. This tilting tool must only be used when the stuffing box is mounted. The piston is then lifted and the support removed from under it. Cover the opening in the engine platform. Lay the piston in a horizontal position on wooden planking. Push the stuffing box up against the collar and disassemble the stays with lifting eye bolts. Remove the protective nut from the piston rod and mount a lifting nut in its place. Lift the piston so that it rests on its crown with wooden planking underneath. the clearance between piston crown and skirt is measured with all piston assembly screws loosened. Now the piston assembly screws are mounted. Brush the threads clean and lubricate them with a mixture of 1 part oil plus 1 part graphite. Place new locking discs on them and tighten them diagonally with a skeleton spanner. The bolts are then tightened twice diagonally with a torque spanner set at 400 Newton meters for the K90 engine. When the tightening is completed, the clearance between the piston crown and skirt is again measured with a feeler gauge. The difference in the clearance in tightened and loose condition indicates the assembly force in the piston. Consult the instruction manual for detailed information. Once this check has been made, the bolts may be secured with locking discs. Begin the pressure test by filling the piston with lubricating oil. After this, the special pressure testing device is mounted on the piston rod foot. A hose is fitted over the nipple and the cock is opened. A pressure of 6 bar is used. Check that there is no oil leakage in the cooling insert or the piston crown. If everything is okay, bleed the pressure and remove the hose. Lower the piston once again into a horizontal position, resting on wooden planking. The lifting tool is then removed and the protective nut is replaced. Place an oil collecting receptacle under the cock on the pressure testing device and drain as much oil as possible out of the piston. The remaining oil can be drained out when the piston is again in an upright position. After having completed the pressure testing, all that remains is to mount the piston rings. Once again, the piston is lifted up and placed in the same position it had when the piston crown was disassembled, with the piston resting directly on the support on the upper platform. All rings must be mounted using the special piston ring expander in order to prevent deformation. Mount the rings so that the ring gaps face in opposite directions in successive grooves. Should old and new rings be used on the same piston, be sure that the older rings are placed on the lowest grooves. Check once again that the piston rings move freely in the grooves. All work on the piston crown and the cooling insert is now completed. While the piston is still in position on the engine platform, a stuffing box overhaul can be carried out. Overhaul of the piston rod stuffing box. There are 2 special holes on the box where bolts may be inserted. The lifting wire is placed over these bolts. Slide the stuffing box up a bit on the piston rod. Mount a work table under the stuffing box. Lower the stuffing box onto the work table. If the O-ring seems to be in good condition, remove it carefully from its groove and push it onto the piston rod. Remove the locking discs and unscrew the bolts holding the two halves of the housing together. Pull one half to one side and remove it from the table. The clearance between the rings and grooves is checked while the rings are still in place. Use a feeler gauge. For the K90GF, the clearance should be between 0.1 and 0.2 millimeters for both sealing and scraper rings. If the clearance is greater, the rings must be replaced. Once clearance has been checked, pull the other housing half away. Press down all sealing and scraper rings against the work table and check the gap between the ring ends. The easiest way of checking this is by securing one part and pressing the other three against it. Begin with the sealing rings, which consist of 4 parts with a clearance totaling 20 millimeters. Should the clearance be less than 10 millimeters, the rings must be replaced. The scraper rings consist of 3 parts with a clearance totaling 9 millimeters. If the clearance is less than 4 millimeters, the lamellae must be replaced. Remove the springs retaining the rings. Take off the ring segments and stack them in the correct order on the table. The lamellae are taken out using a screwdriver. Press new lamellae into the segments. Tape a piece of number 400 emery cloth around the piston rod. Remove any sharp corners on the lamellae by drawing the segments back and forth over the emery cloth. After this, clean the segments carefully in kerosene or similar agent. The condition of the springs determines whether they seal properly or not. Springs are checked by securing one end on a fixed point and the other end on a spring scale. Unstretched, the spring of a K90 GF engine measures 644 millimeters in new condition. Stretched to 834 millimeters, the scale should read 25 Newton. If stretching is continued to 1062 millimeters, the scale should read 55 Newton. After the spring scale has been removed, the spring should return to its 644 millimeter length. Check this data in each different engine's own instruction manual. Reassembly. Before reassembling the stuffing box, clean the housing parts carefully. Reposition only one housing half first. This simplifies the replacement of the rings in their grooves. The spring is inserted first, and then the ring segments one after another. When the ring is in place, the spring is hooked together. One ring joint placed dead center in the opening will simplify guiding the other housing half into place. Lift the other housing half into position. Tighten the bolts and secure them with locking discs. Replace the undamaged O-ring in its groove. On later models of the stuffing box, there is an additional scraper ring above the sealing rings. Even this ring is remounted after careful inspection of both ring and spring. Exact instructions may be found in the Instruction Manual, Volume 2, Section 902. The lifting wire is connected to the lifting bolts, and the box is raised so that the table can be removed. When this is done, the box is lowered slowly onto the piston rod foot. The wires and bolts are removed. This completes the disassembly and assembly of the piston and stuffing box. The piston is now ready for replacement in the cylinder or for storage as a spare part.
Благодарим вас за просмотр, подписывайтесь на канал, ставьте лайки, пишите комментарии, и до новых встреч!